So I noticed that I'm one of the most boring persons here because I'm not disrupting your scheme. I'm actually here doing what I thought I would do. I'm very happy with the invitation, and I'm very happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to very much to discussions and to your interpretation of what I'm saying. I want to speak about law in the era of data-driven agency. And here you see something that is driven, that is literally driven. It drives itself, they say, but actually it's data that drives it. Let's see if this works. Yes. Here you see another picture where the emphasis shifts from the data-driven and the driving to the idea of agency. Agency is something that I want to discuss. Here you see a particular agent, something that is identifiable, and you see that the woman that is having a discussion or at least having a communication with the agent, and there is some emotion going on. In the previous slide, you saw an agent that is hardwired, that is like a robot. I don't know if you can read the cartoon. It's very small letters. I will tell you what it says. You see two people looking rather sad. They actually got the new iPhone, or they got an upgrade to the iOS 6. And the one tells the other, let me see what they say exactly. I don't think that Siri was this condescending in iOS 5. Now, this is very interesting. Why? Because when you look back, maybe I should do it like this. When you look back, this is Google, self-driving car. Google does data-driven stuff, but it's not really interested in trying to guess your emotions and to play with your emotions. When you look at this agent, you can already see that there is some sort of empathy going on. And when you look at Siri, and I don't know if you ever used Siri, but Siri has synthetic emotion recognition. So it tries to guess your mood and to manipulate you a bit on the basis of that. And it is something that Google so far is not interested in. It's not trying to give you search results on the basis of your emotional manipulability. Now, moving into the era of data-driven agency also implies moving into the era of distributed agency. We are used to thinking in terms of agents as kind of unities that are identifiable, that you can recognize as such. Well, most of the agency in artificially intelligent systems is more distributed. Even if you look at the robot, to the extent that the robot is really intelligent, whatever that means, it is probably part of cloud robotics, which means that it can check back into the cloud, upload your behavioral data that it is observing into the cloud, aggregate it with that of other robots, and then look for patterns and begin to interact on that basis. That means that this robot is actually a distributed agent. Part of it is in the hardware here, but part of it is up in the cloud, and that cloud can, of course, also be distributed. This can be quite amazing. Like you can see in the picture, the woman looked like she's getting distributed also. This is a brain teaser. So your brain thinks that a face has two eyes and one mouth, and it's trying to figure out this face. Because it's not so easy. That's how it was designed, of course. You get this attempt at consolidation. Now, this is kind of the core question that I want to discuss with you. It's a citation of my own book, I'm sorry. The question is whether modern law, and I will explain to you what I mean with modern law, can afford to remain unaffected by the changing information and communication infrastructure. And if that is not the case, if it cannot remain unaffected, whether and how it should be transformed to sustain its identity. So I'm trying to say, okay, if we value the rule of law, if that is something we want to sustain, if that is the identity of the law that we want to protect, then it might have to change to sustain this identity. And we'll come back to that, of course. Now I want to go quickly through a couple of slides that, a couple of quotes that kind of show you what I think the law is all about. This is a quote from Marshall Salins, a famous anthropologist. And he says 3 umpires of Major League Baseball were debating how to call balls and strikes. Don't ask me what that is, but it is something that umpires decide. And the first says, I call them the way they are. That's a naive realist, you could say. The second says, I call them the way I see them. That's a social constructivist, you could say. And the third said, no. The third has been around a little bit longer. They ain't nothing until I call them. Now, I think that is the core of the law. Legal effect comes from determining that something counts as a legally relevant fact, which can be brought under a legal norm. And from that moment onward, that legal effect is operational. It reminds me of another very famous quote, originally from 1928, from Thomas and Thomas, sociologists, who said, if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. You could say that is another way of explaining social constructivism. So if we decide with all of us that if I register my marriage in the civil registry, that a whole series of legal effects will then take place, be effective, the force of law. If we say that that is the case, if we define marriage as such, then the consequences of that definitions are real, because people are going to act on them, and they have a lot of, it's like throwing a stone in water, and the consequences go in all directions. Now, this is a very famous quote. It was popularized later by a famous philosopher of science, Robert Merton, when he described the self-fulfilling prophecy. But I want to take the original position of Thomas and Thomas, and I usually change the terms, and I say, if machines, and let's say in this case, if data-driven agents define a situation as real, it is real in its consequences. And this is what is happening today all the time. So a large part of our life world, our everyday reality, is already determined by these kind of systems. Some last preliminary remarks. Law is actually built on the distinction between matter as passive and mind as active. Legal subjects, we attribute a mind to it. We think matter is an issue of facts, and mind is what makes facts out of whatever is the matter. Now, this distinction simply no longer holds. We are already, I don't have to talk in future tense anymore, we are already surrounded by what I call mindless agents. So these agents have no mind, at least not in our sense, but they are agents. I will get back to that. And law is also based, of course, on the distinctions between an agent And the rest of the world, we call that legal subjects. We define specific entities as legal subjects. And you could say that the rest of the world is sort of distributed. It is not a unity of action, time, and place, to use an old Aristotelian notion of an act, in theater that is. While agents, to be qualifiable as an agent, have to be somehow steering from a center. They have to be some sort of unity that endures over time. And I would say that the simplest definition of an agent is a unity of perception and action. So an agent perceives things that can be just a camera. It can be a thermostat that perceives temperature and then acts, and then again observes temperature and then acts again. So it can be very simple agents, but also much more complex. And I would call this unity of perception and action in the tradition of Varela and others, who say basically that perception and action are two sides of the same coin. You cannot act if you cannot perceive your environment. And I would go a step further, based on a lot of research, both in neuroscience and in artificial intelligence. You cannot perceive if you cannot act, because there is no use perceiving anything if you do not act. There is one guy, I think he's an artificial intelligence or other computer scientist, who says the reason why mammals at some point began to develop this wetware up here, this centralized stuff we call brains, that does a whole lot of processing, that started that movement from the minute people started moving. Because if I move there, then I might run into something. And if others are also doing the same thing, then I need a lot of processing to prevent me running into something else. As long as we were plants also move, we call that growing, but it's a bit slower than this kind of navigation. That sort of central processing unit, Wolpert says, is not necessary. Well, here again, this distinction no longer holds, because we're actually surrounded by what I call distributed agential systems. So not all the systems that have artificial intelligence are identifiable as a particular agent. Usually they're below the radar, and they're very distributed. They're polymorphous. They can change, especially if we're talking about software. They can be embedded at different places. And it doesn't always make sense then to call them an agent. But you could say it's a system with agential characteristics. Let's move further into this idea of agency. You could say there are three senses of agency. From a computer science perspective, agents are defined as an entity that has a capacity to act autonomously. That means it can act also when it's not triggered from the outside. That can perceive its environment and adapt to changes in the environment. So there are feedback loops. And it has certain endurance as an identifiable unity of action and perception. Of course, from the perspective of computer science, there is no assumptions that such entities have a mind, that they are moral, or that they have consciousness. In the legal sense, actually, it's very simple. An agent is a proxy that is acting on behalf of a principal. And in law, at this moment, I think everywhere, not just in Belgium or most states of Europe, but I think everywhere, if you want to be an agent in the legal sense, you have to be a legal subject. So both the principal and the agent have to be a legal subject. That means an artificial agent, to the extent that it's not a legal subject, and I have no knowledge of any law anywhere at this moment that has attributed legal personhood to artificial agents, unless you want to call a corporation a legal agent, an artificial agent. So that means that they cannot fulfill this role at this moment of a legal agent. From the perspective of moral philosophy, and this actually has a lot to do with the law, because it co-determines which sort of entities we are willing to attribute legal personhood. You could say that human agency is the capacity to engage in meaningful action. There is a big difference between behavior and when you look at what artificial agents and computer science does in terms of behavior, it's actually about behaviors with an S, plural. I had a very stringent discussion with a sociologist, actually a political scientist, who told me, stop saying behaviors. That's wrong language. We have behavior. It's not English. And I said, look, maybe I agree with you from a philosophical point of view. But what these machines are doing is calculating, observing, and measuring our behaviors with an S. And that is really something different. And actually, it would be very interesting to write a PhD on the difference between the old sociological term behavior, or that term in the science of zoology, or whatever, and this new computational term behaviors. So the movements I'm making now, I was just scratching my neck, sorry, that is a behavior. And actually, if I'm being taped now, if that was a smart camera, it could sort of measure every instance, every pixel of my movement. And it could aggregate that with other movements that I make or that other makes and draw all kinds of conclusions from that. Like, for instance, that I might develop Parkinson's disease in between 6 to 12 years. That's a statistic, that sort of behaviors. Human agency is something that concerns action. Action is something different than behavior. Behavior, you take an external perspective. Action means you're thinking about meaning attribution. Usually in moral philosophy, we talk about human agency as something that is based as action, as entities that are capable of action, based on beliefs and reasons, notably second-order reasons. Maybe I would love to have a gin and tonic now. That's might be my primary desire. But then my second-order desire is that I do not want to be the sort of person where the students later say, wow, Hildebrandt has got a nice professorship, but she's a little bit alcoholic. Anyway, the second-order desire would be that I don't want to be the person that is addicted to something. And this is typical for us. We then rule our first-order desire from our second-order desires. Now, this is interesting because when you look at artificial agency in computing science and artificial intelligence, cognitive science, then lots of those machines, if they are smart, they don't just do first order and second order reasoning, but n order, third, fourth. This is mathematics, so they can do exponential order reasoning, and they can do very smart things on the basis of that. Just like our unconscious mind is capable of doing. But our conscious mind is much simpler. It can do maybe 2, 3, 4 order reasoning, and then we get confused. And that's very interesting. It means that the really smart artificial intelligence at this moment is more like our unconscious mind than like our conscious mind. That relates to the fact that, taking this perspective, there are actually 3 types of agents. So you can talk about all living agents, starting from plants that do not have a centralized nervous center, So they do not have a frontal observation, have no central processing, moving towards animals and then ending up with the mammals that develop at some point this central nervous system and then highlighted in the brains. This also means the development of consciousness. Let's be prudent and say there's a correlation between consciousness and a central nervous center with something like brains. A consciousness of the here and now. So it means I'm conscious of being here, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm conscious of being conscious. That is something that us humans like to be, or are, since we began speaking. But animals have this consciousness, and it also means that they're capable of suffering, for instance. They're capable of suffering. Artificial intelligence, so far doesn't have consciousness, is not capable of suffering. But it is capable now of simulating emotions and of recognizing emotions. And that also means if there is some goal to be achieved with that, it could simulate suffering. Now, humans developed this thing, language. So I can stand here now and talk about something that is not here, either in space because it's far away, or in time because it was yesterday, or it was 5,000 years ago. Because then, of course, we need written language. So what language does, it suddenly creates this enormous world where there is memory, anticipation. It's very difficult for us to realize the disruption that happens when you begin to speak and when this whole inner world sort of gets built up. And you could say that we also have emotions, like animals also have emotions, obviously. Emotions are physical things. You can measure them, actually. But what we then do is develop feelings. So we begin to think about them. We begin to talk about them. And we look back at them, reflection. The interesting thing about artificial agents is that in the last century, for a long time, those studying and developing artificial agency were entirely focused on top-down, on logic. So the idea is we figure out how our intelligence works, we build it somewhere, we put it in a machine, and then we have another intelligent being. As we all know, that didn't work. So we now have an entirely different type of artificial intelligence, where the idea is that you build something that is capable of learning. That means capable of seeing its environment, acting on it, checking back the effects of the action, and then adapting your own environment. That is now intelligence. But again, there is no consciousness. I saw that a neurologist, I think a retired neurologist, wrote an interesting piece, which I quote here in the New York Times, where he said, let's stop trying to make one big definition for intelligence or agents. Let's take the biological bias out. And he says, let's separate species, different species, with distinct types of intelligence. And he says, well, animals and plants are also intelligent. We know that now, and we try to differentiate. So let's do the same thing with machines. This is a proposition to say maybe these machines are a new species. The core of data-driven agency is machine learning. So we have all this data, but actually the data are not very interesting, because the more data you have, the less you know, because you can't find your way in them. So actually it's more about data flows. There are all these streams of data. We now have apps, applications on the internet, apps that collect data, that centralize data, that work with the data, do things. And then, of course, we have the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things is now, from the technical side, described as a cyber-physical infrastructure. So that means you begin to not just connect individual things, but that you build entire hardware systems that are connected with the internet online, that can communicate with each other. And that these systems run is thanks to machine learning. There's a wonderful definition, at least I love it. It's sort of very mathematical, but that shows a lot about what machine learning is. In a handbook of Tom Mitchell, where he says, we talk about machine learning, or about a machine that learns, with respect to a particular task T, performance metric P, and type of experience E, if the system reliably improves its performance P at task E, T, following experience E. Very simple, very simple. But it also shows that if there is machine learning, all these parameters have to be defined. You have to define a certain occurrence that can be observed by the machine, that can be measured as experience. And you have to define your task in terms that the machine can show, can perform. That means that everything that is not machine readable remains outside the scope of machine learning, which is very interesting, of course. This is a nice example, not necessarily part of machine learning, but it is something that is happening all the time, all around us. It's called A/B testing. I'm sure that all the nice websites that you know, all the nice websites where you go and you say, oh, this is a great site, that they are continuously being A/B tested. And more interesting, actually, you are being A/B tested continuously. It's a very simple protocol. You have a site and you want to improve it. So you change something very small and banal, a color, for instance. Here you see a change in color. And you call the first site version A, the second version B. And people who go to that site, they don't know anything about that. Just half of them goes to version 1, A, and the other half to version B. Nobody is aware of this. It happens all the time when you go online, but you don't know. Then the software checks which site works better. So where people buy more, where they read more, if you're a newspaper, or read a particular type of information, click more on advertisements, because this is about business models. As soon as you have that measured, and it turns out that version B is better, you move on with version B, making a small change, the whole process goes all over again. If you have automated that, you can continuously improve your site. I don't know if you've ever read privacy policies. I wouldn't advise it. But there's always this sentence that the purpose of the processing of the data is the improvement of the service. Well, here this is what they mean. Now try to think of moving from websites to the Internet of Things, to this cyber-physical infrastructure. So we have software, we have search engines, behavioral advertising, credit rating, basing hiring decisions on that sort of software. And now we are beginning to develop the Internet of Things. So think of smart energy systems, remote healthcare, cloud robotics, self-driving cars, traffic management systems. Now imagine that your care robot, they're not yet around, but they are expected at some point. Imagine that your care robot or your robot nanny is all the time doing A/B testing on your real-life behaviors. And imagine the same for all these distributed polymorphous mobile agents that live in the web. This is actually already happening. But imagine if your entire environment begins to do A/B testing on you and me and everybody else. The result of this will be that we're going to be so incredibly happy, right? Like, we have these wonderful websites. So imagine if we put in some 3D printing, you can improve your environment. And this sounds like science fiction and like something very dystopian or whatever you want, something very utopian. But it's real. It's not a joke. It's not something that is in the far future. I'm going to make a very brief intermezzo by looking at some of the sayings of Oliver Wendell Holmes, a famous legal pragmatist in the United States, who said the life of the law has not been logic, it has been experience. Now that's interesting. We have just discovered in artificial intelligence that if you build it on logic, you get some very simple systems that can't do very much. Build them on experience, incredible what they can do. He also said for the rational study of the law, the black letter man may have been the man of the present, but the man of the future is the man of statistics and the master of economics. Wow. And then, of course, the last thing that he says is the prophecies of what the court will do in fact, and nothing more pretentious is what I mean with the law. I very often hear this quotation wrong. People say, yeah, the legal pragmatists, they say that the law is what the courts say. That would, of course, be very stupid, and there would be no job for us lawyers. It's because we don't know what the court will say tomorrow that we have a job. So Oliver Wendell Holmes said, the law, that's an anticipation. It's an anticipation. And that anticipation, of course, has influence on what's going to happen. And he said, anticipation, you can link him to hermeneutics, to interpretation, to Gadamer, maybe even to Heidegger, if you like. But you can also move the other way around and say what he basically said is this statistics, because he actually talked about it like that, should be in the service of legal subjects, of those that want to know where do I stand, how is my behavior going to be qualified. It should not be in the hand of the state, for instance, to manipulate us. So this anticipation is very emancipatory. It provides for legal certainty. So now I need to know the time. Otherwise, 10 to 5, okay. Okay, I want to briefly talk about how does this connect to the law? Why do I tell this entire story about data-driven agency? Let's look at law and technology and the relationship between the two. This is a Necker cube, but not a cube. This is a photograph that you can see in two ways, but try to look at those two ways at the same time. This is not possible. Either this way, that way, and it's also not always possible to consciously look at it to make the shift. Now, I think that's a very important capability, to be able to look at the same thing from different angles, even if you can't do it at the same time. Let's think about what is technology. I want to discuss 3 ways of looking at technology and 3 ways of looking at law, and they look very much alike, actually. So the first one is technological volunteerism. That means technology is a tool, and with that tool I can do good things and bad things, and it's up to me. I can also do nothing with it. Like Lynn White, a famous historian of technology, he said, look, technology just opens a door. It doesn't compel you to enter. It's like the famous story, you can bring a horse to the water, but you can't force it to drink. So the idea is technology is just neutral. So it's only a tool, it's only an instrument. It doesn't change us, it doesn't change the world. That's one way of looking at it. Another way is technological determinism. So like continental philosophers like Jacques Ellul and American technology philosophers like Landon Winner. They say, look, it's not that simple. Actually, on the contrary, technologies determine what we can do and what we cannot do. If you build a wall with a door in it, then you can go through the door. But if you build a wall without a door, you can't go through it. So that is determinative of your action potential. And usually these determinists are either dystopian or utopian. A lot of people tell me when I explain my research subjects, they say, oh, it's no use what you're doing. Technology is very dynamic and it will go its way. You can't do anything about that. That is a cliche technology determinism. It's total and complete bullshit, and it takes very little effort to show that. So let's take a third conception, not a middle one or a mix or something like that. No, it's another conception of technology, a relational conception. The shortest summary is one of Kranzberg's laws, where he said, technology is neither good nor bad in itself, but it's never neutral. It does things. It affords things or it doesn't afford them. So yes, technology is a tool, it's an instrument, but it's much more than an instrument. It changes both the person who uses it and the environment. Don Eide, another famous philosopher of technology, says, and many actually say that, technology reinvents us while we reinvent those technologies. So, take an example of a speed bump that's obviously instrumental. You could say it regulates driving. You want people to drive slower. You could also say that it constitutes a particular way of driving. If the bump is well designed, some bumps are so low that you can just drive over them. But if they're well designed, there's only one way of doing it, and that is slowing down, or you have to be very clever. Now, you could also imagine a set of obstructions on the road, which means that you can't go into it at all. It's not that you can only drive slow, but you can't go into it. So, technologies can be either regulative of behavior or constitutive. Regulative means that it induces or inhibits specific behaviors. Constitutive means that it enforces or rules out specific behaviors. And the point is that whether a specific technology is regulative or constitutive is an empirical question. You have to go and look at how it is designed, what it affords, and how it's taken up. So what is the point here? The point is that sometimes technologies are determinative of our behavior, yes, but not because they are a technology with a big T, but because that's how they were designed. Okay, sometimes we go very fast. This slide is just to put my cards on the table. There are a lot of legal philosophers. This is, I believe, a legal philosopher who has given the most penetrating account of law. There are a lot of legal philosophers who are more into political philosophy, but I think that he very nicely shows what is important about law, what makes something qualify as law. So, very fast he talked about law as something that strives for justice, which he defined in terms of fairness, equality. Legal certainty, which he defined in terms of the positiveness of law, and purposiveness, which shows that law is an instrument to order public life. And where he was brilliant is that he says these three aims are not always in practice compatible. So sometimes choices have to be made. And that may mean that if a law is not just, that it is still law. But if a law doesn't strive to be just anymore, then it's no longer law. There are heated debates over what this means exactly, but it gives me some tools to now move into the three conceptions of law. So again, you can say that law, you can see it as a neutral instrument for social engineering. So you're a policymaker, a politician, you want to achieve a certain policy. You can do that with law, or you can do it with nudging, or you can do it with techno-regulation. This is, in fact, a rule by law. You use law as an instrument and nothing more. You can see this in terms of a regulatory paradigm in policy science. And I have the feeling that that regulatory paradigm, which sees law as an instrument to influence behaviors, you can see that coming into legal scholarship. The second one is law as something that is autonomous, an independent discipline or practice. That means you emphasize the legal certainty aspect. So this is like formal legal positivism, the separation thesis. Here we have morality, there we have politics, and this is law, and the three should not be mixed. And as you can understand, I don't think it's a good idea to find the third way by mixing these, but I look at law as a relational concept. So law is always about attributing legal effect on the basis of certain relations between people and things, and about checks and balances, about countervailing powers. And then you have the rule of law. Now my point is that these are things that everybody talks about in legal theory, that we differ on some points, but there's a lot that we take for granted, usually the things that we do not talk about. And I believe that this thing, modern law, so not the law of a society without a state, but our type of law, that this is an affordance of the printing press. And I'm going to try and explain that to you. This is not technological determinism. I'm not saying that because the printing press is there, modern law had to emerge. A lot more is needed for that. But it certainly was an affordance of the printing press. And that raises the question, if we're moving into this other information and communication infrastructure, will this type of law still be an affordance? Maybe not. Why should we assume that? And if we want to protect some of the aspects of modern law that we think very important, then we have to rethink how to design this new information and communication infrastructure. Okay. Why do I say that modern law is an affordance of the printing press, is made possible by the printing press? Try to think of a society without the script. Nobody can write. So if you want to tell somebody something, if you want to communicate, you'll have to do it by speaking. Now, the minute writing comes into a society, it becomes possible to externalize a legal norm, to write it, to inscribe it somewhere. Then it is outside of you and you can look at it. And that thing is the same for everybody, that inscription. It also means that when you are the author of that norm, You have externalized it. So when you die or you go away, that norm is still there. So the norm survives its author, the legislator. That implies that there is a distanciation going on between the author of the norm and the group that is addressed. Actually, when you have the script, you're not limited to the people that you can talk to face, but you can use your civil servants, for instance, to send them out with this text to a much larger territory. So the scope of the jurisdiction is suddenly extended enormously. This is historically traceable. So the rise of the state and the emergence of the script, they enable each other. Now, think of this distance. So there is this norm. It's externalized. It's inscribed. The author is dead or very far away. Now we have to decide, what does this norm mean? Because somebody wants to apply it. Lawyers are always talking about interpretation. We think that's very important. And we can, this is like in our DNA. But that's where it comes from. If, as an author, you cannot force the meaning that you thought of on the person that you're talking to, because you're no longer there, this need for interpretation arises. Historically, that means that for a long time, there was a class of scribes, that is people that could write, we're not yet in the era of the printing press, that had a kind of monopoly. In that situation, often the ruler could not write, and the people could not write. But there was this buffer in between, class of scribes who could write. So they had a monopoly. They knew what the norms were. And then at some point, these lawyers get integrated into the bureaucracy of the state, and this is the development of the bureaucratic state. You see that we move from adjudication to to legislation as an important way of solving problems. The increasing complexity that you see as soon as the printing press comes in, you get a proliferation of text. So disagreement about what texts mean becomes exponential. And then the task of the lawyers becomes to make it coherent, dependable, reliable, to create a web of meaning in all this text that people can depend on. And at some point, this class of lawyers then tells the ruler, the emperor, you mind your own business, we decide the law. For centuries, the courts had to decide what the king said. And because of this monopoly that sort of emerged from the need to interpret law, the lawyers were able to throw the king out of that position. That is historically the emergence of the rule of law. It is directly connected to this infrastructure. Now, of course, this is extremely fast, so I hope I didn't convince you, because that would be too easy. You can read about it and think about it. Now, if that is true, that the mode of existence of the law, how the law exists, what we qualify as law, depends on the prevailing information and communication infrastructure, then what does that mean when we're on the verge of entering in a totally different era? I want to now talk about the idea of technology-specific law and technology-neutral law. When you read about law and technology, there are always these arguments that law has to be neutral towards technology. Now, I've just given you a big story that law always depends on the prevailing ICI. And in that sense, law is never technologically neutral. Nevertheless, let's now stick to the context of the rule of law. That's still our context. And I'm going to argue for the neutrality of law with regard to specific technologies. When you read the literature about technology neutrality, you see three objectives. The innovation objective, the sustainability objective, and the compensation objective. The innovation objective says, well, if you begin to regulate a specific type of technology, then you're going to disturb the market. Some companies will not be able to meet the threshold or whatever. We shouldn't do that. This is, if you read text of the European Commission, you will often meet that argument. There is, of course, the sustainability objective. If you begin to regulate a specific type of technology that we have now, the law will probably be outdated very soon because technology goes very fast. Sustainability argument. I want to look at the third objective, the compensation objective. What if new technologies actually transform what the law protects, the substance of the law? Let's take an example. A smartphone. If you do a search on somebody's body, I'm talking criminal law, you can confiscate the goods that that person has on her body. There's a rule for that. Now think of a smartphone. So you can take that smartphone and then take it to the police office and look into it. The constraints on search and seizure in a house, in a home, and search and seizure on a person are very different. In a home, they're much more strict. If we would leave it like that, the substance of the protection would be enormously diminished. Because this technology makes possible to carry around more of your private life in your smartphone than in your house. Now, this is a very obvious example. Everybody understands that that means you have to make a technology-specific rule which allows you to make the law neutral again, to compensate what happened, so that it provides the same type of protection. Okay, so I will try to round off now by talking about the concept of legal protection by design. So there are two reasons to talk about that. One, because the landscape that law aims to order has changed. Two, because the infrastructure that enables the force of law, printing press, has changed. It's two different things. These changes regard the scope, the scale, the speed, the distance, automation, and invisibility of what happens around you. There are new types of knowledge around, new types of interventions that were not there before. There are invisible predictions and preemptions, invisible preemption. Preemption means that, let's say, the machine, the agent, has acted, has influenced you, probably without you knowing. The idea is that it is necessary to build compensation into the architecture of this new landscape. And if you don't do this, then the substance of the protection of the law simply goes up into thin air. Law itself, that's a different challenge, but it's the other side of the same coin. So you see the movement from text to code. You see a preoccupation that was always with action that is now moving towards behavior. And you see a shift from the force of law, something very difficult to understand, or ideas like nudging, framing, and priming. So sort of getting under people's skin to influence them. Okay, I'm going to keep this very short. I won't go through the rest of the slides in great detail. When you use technology to influence people, sort of behind their back to achieve your policy goal. That is called techno-regulation. That is not legal protection by design. What I mean by legal protection by design is that at the level of the design, you try to support legal norms, and for these norms embedded into this infrastructure, two characteristics of law have to be met. So it has to be the democratic legislator that decides on these inscriptions, so democratic participation, that's a form of transparency also. And these legal norms that are inscribed in the architecture must be contestable in a court of law, because these are the two hallmarks of the rule of law now. So if you want to design norms into a technology, for it to be legal norms, these two characteristics have to be met. And I think I'll leave it like that.